I hope that everyone had selected proper language channel for participation in this event. Panelists, dear participants, we are glad to welcome you at today's webinar on international recommendations on the statistics of IDPs in Ukrainian context, analytic overview organized by the State Statistics Service of Ukraine in partnership with the representation of IOM in Ukraine and with the financial support of the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration of the State Department of US. In 2020, Statistics Commission of UN approved international recommendations on statistics for IDPs prepared by the expert group on the refugees and IDP statistics and for people without citizenship. Implementation of this international tool is very important because it will enhance development of factual-based policies, and this will improve integration of IDPs and finding durable solution for them, and to have systematic and comprehensive achievement of the fundamental principle that is enhanced, that is a part of the sustainable development goals, don't leave anyone behind. We are presenting the analytical report based on the work of the expert group on how we can implement IRIS in Ukraine. And we will listen to the key experts in statistics on IDPs of global level. And I'm very glad to introduce for opening words the head of the Statistics Service of Ukraine. Thank you, Irina. I want to thank all our partners, thanks to whom this event was made possible. And I would like thanks to Mr. Anand Nguyen from the IOM for our perfect long year cooperation on statistics issues, and in particular on statistics on IDPs. I also want to thanks to the Bureau of the Affairs of Refugees and Migrants of United States for the support in the work that was done in Ukraine on development of this area of statistics on IDPs. And I want to thanks to Ms. Natalia, the IRIS coordinator, who made a great contribution for us to have the possibility today to exchange our thoughts about the document that will be presented today. I also want to thank to our Ms. Olena Shevtsova, the person who was directly involved in preparing the document that will be presented today. And this document is a work of a lot of people and which involve not only state authorities, but also international organizations and partners. And thank you for the great work that you have done. And this work cannot be underestimated. We know that the aggression of Russian Federation in the east of Ukraine, the temporary occupation of the Crimea, of Sevastopol and in Donbass caused a large wave of IDPs in Ukraine. And the key problem that we facing now as a State Statistics Service of Ukraine is on in which way to collect statistical data to analyze it about this category of person who are who became IDPs. And from this point of view, recommendations or IRIS recommendations, implementations of these standards will be hugely important and very valuable for us. One more time, I want to thank everyone who were involved and contributed to this document. And I want to wish everyone a fruitful discussion, and maybe there will be questions. And I'm very grateful to all of you for the great work that you've done, for the partnership relations we established with all stakeholders, and I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Igor Evgenievich. And State Statistics Service of Ukraine and International Migration Organization are the members of the steering committee of EGRIS. And in 2020, we jointly initiated the creation of the expert group on IRIS implementation, and it's a mechanism for exchange of information, like exchange of expertise and coordinating our efforts. I would like to invite our long-time partner who is steering the work of this group, His Excellency Head of the IOM in Ukraine, Mr. Jan.
Thank you. Dear Madam Moderator, Natalia, Igor, Renee, and dear colleagues, I first want to welcome you all and to wish you a great start for 2022. And it's really great to see that we have over 110 participants on this workshop. At the risk of stating the obvious, please let me nevertheless underline that harmonized and coordinated approaches to data collection and production of statistics on IDPs are key ingredients to facilitating effective responses to internal displacement. For 26 years, IOM has been providing support to Ukraine on several broad migration management thematic areas, including emergency, transition, and recovery programs aimed at providing support to conflict-affected communities and to internally displaced people. Particularly, we're looking at reducing the protection and assistance needs linked to IDP's displacement and for local integration. Since March 2016, we have conducted regular surveys on the national monitoring system in the situation for IDPs, which has served as one of the key sources of IDP data for national and international partners, and importantly, provides us evidence for programming decisions. For example, the NMS data highlighted the housing needs for IDPs, which helped to inform our affordable housing program in Kramatorsk and Severodonetsk, where we're building more than 500 units for IDPs with a portion allocated for the local community. This is through the generous funding and partnership with the German government through KfW. But the MNS data also highlighted economic linkages. So an employment livelihood program is in the works to complement what we're doing with the housing to have a more area and multi-sectoral based intervention. There are other actors, government and non-governmental organizations involved in addressing the diverse consequences of internal displacement in Ukraine. And so thus a clear and shared understanding of what the key bottlenecks to durable solutions are in Ukraine can enable effective evidence-based programs for IDPs that can lead to more sustainable and lasting impacts. With this understanding, and as a result of our first workshop held over a year ago, the State Statistics Service of Ukraine and IOM initiated the establishment of a technical working group to ensure a coordinated and coherent process to developing a joint approach to IDP statistics in country, as Igor mentioned. The working group identified the international recommendations on IDPs, IRIS, as the key international framework to guide our discussion and to facilitate the enhancement of IDP statistics in country. The working group acts as a coordination platform and a mechanism for the exchange of information, analysis, design, and joint development of a strategy for the work ahead. IOM is proud and very grateful for the fruitful discussions and collaborative spirit shown by the working group members. Indeed, the key objective currently lies in developing a joint roadmap for the implementation of IRIS recommendations in Ukraine. I would like to highlight the importance of the collaborative efforts to enhance IDP statistics in Ukraine. The partnership between the Ministry of Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories, UNHCR, and other UN agencies, national and international NGOs, and other key stakeholders unlocks a range of opportunities which we are eager to explore. Together, piece by piece, we have a chance to compose a comprehensive understanding of the situation of IDPs to ensure that in our present and future programming leaves no one behind. I would like to congratulate the State Statistics Service and the government of Ukraine on their remarkable progress in this direction, and proudly would like to note that Ukraine is among the first countries globally to take concrete steps towards applying the IRIS recommendations. We're delighted to have had the opportunity to chair this exciting process with SSSU. Today, we would like to present and discuss with you the first set of results of the collaboration work done by the working group and the thorough analysis of the current state of play in IDP statistics in Ukraine, and the first set of recommendations are advancing further. We look forward to hearing the presentations from national and global experts on IDP statistics from DRC, IDPs, UNHCR, as well as IDMC, all of whom have kindly accepted the invitation to share their insights and inspire us for the journey ahead. I would like to thank the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration of the U.S. State Department for their support to the work of the technical working group through 2021, as well as for today's event. Building on a global experience in displacement tracking, IOM is committed to contribute our expertise, as well as to continue facilitating progress towards enhanced IDP statistics in Ukraine. I wish you all a fruitful and productive meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your greeting words. We have to highlight that uniqueness of our working group in Ukraine is that among the members of these working groups, we have members of global level, the EGRIS, the expert group on refugees and IDPs and people without citizenship. I would like to introduce the head of the EGRIS, coordinator who was very active in many events, Miss Natalia. We pass the floor to you, and we're very grateful for the support of EGRIS in the work of the Ukrainian group and for the possibility to present our results at the UN Data Forum in 2021. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. But thank you very much for that introduction and also to the invitation to speak at this event, to say a few words up front before we get into the more substantial presentations from other colleagues. Thank you also to those opening words, both from Mr. Vanier and Mr. Nugin. It's great to have the picture so clearly set right from the start of the session, so that the substantive discussions can really get directly to the points. In light of that, I'll be short. I just wanted to say a few words from the perspective of the global expert group on refugee, IDP, and now statelessness statistics. First of all, just to remind us all that we're quite early on this journey, both in the Ukraine but also globally, to implement the IDP recommendations, the IDP statistics recommendations. They were only endorsed in 2018, Sorry, they were only endorsed in 2020. The refugee recommendations were in 2018, forgive me. They were endorsed in 2020, and of course, since their endorsement, there has been a global COVID-19 pandemic, which has, of course, created a huge interruption for many national statistical systems and plans, data collection activities in many countries on many issues, not only on newer topics such as internal displacement for many statistical offices. So this has not been, if you like, a period that has greatly facilitated implementation. It has been one that has created more hurdles for many national and international partners in the pursuit of this goal. But nevertheless, it has been almost 2 years since they were implemented. Many were skeptical that we would be able to achieve that endorsement, given the many varied political sensitivities around internal displacement and the much varied practice from country to country and region to region that currently exists. But we did manage, with great collaboration from participating EGRIS members, including around 15 to 20 IDP affected states. Leadership from the then IDP subgroup lead, which was the Joint IDP Profiling Service, and we should be grateful to them for their leadership in the process over the preceding years. A strong support, of course, from the rest of the EGRIS community, in particular from UNHCR, with financial support from the World Bank and from the UN Statistics Division. It really was a turning point when the IDP recommendations were endorsed for those working on internal displacement, and of course, particularly for those working on data issues. The IRIS contain, the International Recommendations on IDP Statistics, I refer to them as the IRIS. The IRIS contain, for the first time, internationally agreed upon definitions and guidance for how official statistics on IDPs should be produced. I can't underline this enough. For the first time, this has been internationally agreed. They include, for many, when many of you here will be familiar, but there are probably some who are less familiar with the content. They include common definitions for who should be considered to be an IDP for the purpose of statistics. They include recommended tabulations and indicators, so what data should be produced, what the basic data that should be produced for effective national policy and response. They include recommendations for measuring durable solutions. They include recommendations for how different data sources, so registers, census, surveys, alternative data sources could be used for the production of statistics. And they, of course, importantly, include recommendations for coordination. So looking at the role of NSOs, looking at the role of other national stakeholders and international partners, both within and outside of national statistical systems. So they're a comprehensive set of recommendations, or at least they aim to be. There are some areas that, of course, need some further development. When they were endorsed in 2020, we being the expert group, simultaneously received unanimous endorsement for the third mandate of the expert group. The focus of our current mandate, the third mandate, which will take us up until the end of 2024, is supporting implementation of the recommendations on both refugees and IDPs. We're also working on statelessness statistics, but that's not the topic of today's discussion. But really the main focus of our expert group during this period is to focus on implementation. And we're working on this primarily through promotion and dissemination. So making sure that countries, statistical counterparts at the national level and regional counterparts in all affected regions are aware of the recommendations, know where to find the recommendations, are familiar with the content of the recommendations to be able to facilitate their implementation. On the other hand, working on capacity development in prioritized regions and countries, and working on technical support where there's the need. So it's really exciting, given that is our priority focus, to be part of this webinar today. And it's really exciting for us to be part of this process in the Ukraine to implement the recommendations in this context. Not only because Ukraine is one of our cherished steering committee members, but also, as was mentioned by my previous speaker, it really is the first country globally to be taking such significant strides in this direction. So it's very positive to see. It's great to see the working group established, partnership not just for the sake of partnership, but meaningful partnership with relevant stakeholders. So those who are producing and using statistics on IDPs in a given context. It's great to see that the working group has been established with all relevant stakeholders, and that there is some serious analytical work that has been ongoing that we'll hear more about in a few moments, that has been undertaken to shape the roadmap for how partners can move forward in Ukraine. There are no doubt some difficult questions ahead for this group, difficult decisions to be made, that I hope this webinar will help to inform. But just as I close, I wanted to share my 3 suggestions for the group and the road ahead. I would really encourage the group to, first of all, be pragmatic in the approach. There's probably a huge demand, lots of opportunities, many areas where statistics can be improved, but I would really encourage the group to be pragmatic and to select the few areas where change can really be meaningful and effective. I would also encourage the group to regularly consult the recommendations, not only at this first analytical stage, but maybe further on down the line, to keep them fresh and present in the minds of those teams working on this process. And thirdly, I would really remain focused on issues of national priority when it comes to addressing the remaining gaps in available IDP statistics in Ukraine. It'll be, really important that changes are made and not ones that are kind of theoretically most relevant, but actually issues that support areas of national priority that can be meaningful for data users in this and meaningful for affected communities in this specific displacement context. So with that, I'll close and just say thank you again for inviting me to join. I will stay for the remaining of the session in case there are any questions I can help with during the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for your welcome words and for the valuable insights that you provided for our future work. And now I am glad to welcome our distinguished speakers, Alan Riviere, Regional Coordinator of Refugees on the Embassy of US in Ukraine, and with words of gratitude for the support of our activities. Ms.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today to speak in support of the important work that the State Statistics Service of Ukraine is doing to capture the statistics on internally displaced population and the service's efforts to implement the international recommendations on IDP statistics. The US government, through the Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration's contributions to both IOM Ukraine as well as to the Joint IDP Profiling Service, is providing support for this important work. And while the conflict in the East remains ongoing, those displaced by Russia's aggression continue to seek durable solutions, and it is really necessary to capture accurate data about the population and their needs, their challenges, and their goals in order to make informed, fact-based policy decisions to fully integrate these displaced Ukrainians into their host communities. So it really is commendable that these conversations are happening in Ukraine, especially given the complexities involved in the collection of statistics and the many different purposes the statistics must serve for multiple stakeholders. These stakeholders look to the statistics to inform decisions about social support, transitional justice, the right to return, as well as to determine government funding levels to ensure that there is sufficient capacity to deliver services and develop and implement policy. Especially because these statistics serve so many different purposes, it is important to have a standardized definition of who is in the IDP to specify how one can deregister from IDP status and to clarify how that is captured by state systems, including informal statistics. There is also a need to capture data of those who are not displaced, but who continue to exercise their rights as Ukrainian citizens while residing under the temporary occupation of a hostile actor. It is notable that Ukraine explicitly acknowledged the need for IDP integration in its national planning for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development marks the first time an international framework has acknowledged the importance of inclusion of those who have been internally displaced to the country's development. This recognition is paramount to avoid the pitfalls that have hampered the integration of IDPs in other situations around the world. For example, in some countries, IDP status is inherited from parents, resulting in an increase in the size of the IDP population over the years, and an unfortunate politicization of their existence. In other cases, the status effectively disenfranchises IDPs and increases the obstacles they face in seeking to integrate into different communities within their own country. So I'm looking forward today to the important discussions here, and I hope they'll lead to the development of a roadmap for Ukraine to implement the international recommendations on IDP statistics. Consolidating and harmonizing IDP statistics among stakeholders is one key to developing evidence-based, durable solutions for communities affected by protracted internal displacement in Ukraine. The availability of accurate data is essential for fostering the principle of leaving no one behind and to facilitate progress on Ukraine's stated goal of IDP integration within its 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to speak today in support of these important efforts. The United States remains committed to furthering the resilience of Ukraine and Ukrainians, and we look forward to supporting you all in that endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee, for your words of support. Dear participants, with this, our welcome session is over, and we move to the most interesting part, presentation of the analytical document, the result of the working group in Ukraine. And at the end of this event, we will have Q&A session and discussions. So you're welcome to ask your questions in the general chat to all participants. Those who are participating via Facebook, please send your questions on the Facebook. We will discuss them. And now I pass the floor, and we will start presenting the results of the interim results, and then in the form of the analytical document on the current situation and the key recommendations on IRS in Ukraine. We went this way and split our work in two parts before we will prepare the roadmap. We wanted to prepare a deep analysis to find the most optimal variants of implementation IRS in Ukraine based on the particular situation in Ukraine. Before I will pass the floor to our consultant for his presentation, I want to thank to all participants of the working group in Ukraine for fruitful discussions, for active participation. I want to thank Ministry of Social Policy, Ministry of Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories, to the Secretariat of the Ombudsman, and Ministry of Development of Regional Development of Ukraine, State Immigration Service, Pension Fund of Ukraine. We want to thank international organizations, Danish Refugee Council, and we want to thank non-governmental organizations to Analytical and our external expert, AGRIS, Joint Profiling Service, and to Statistic Bureau of Norway. And thank you to all stakeholders for preparing this document and for agreeing to work further. And these results are very important for us to make particular decisions and prepare such important documents. And now I introduce Mr. Shona Lopman, consultant. of the IOM in Ukraine for presenting the current situation of the statistics in Ukraine.
Thank you. So I'm going to provide an overview of the State of Play paper, the full title being State of Play, Statistics on Internal Displacement in Ukraine, Interim Results of the Work of the International Recommendations Working Group. And the objective of this document is to compare the international recommendations on IDP statistics with existing practices in relation to IDP statistics in Ukraine in order to formulate specific recommendations on ways forward for developing a roadmap for the implementation of IRIS in Ukraine. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. Sorry, thank you. So given that many governmental and non-governmental organizations are involved in developing measures aimed at addressing the consequences of internal displacement in Ukraine, the Statistical Service, the State Statistics Service of Ukraine and IOM mission in Ukraine initiated the establishment of a technical working group to ensure a coordinated and coherent process in the development of the roadmap for the implementation of the IRIS in Ukraine. The TWG, the Technical Working Group, acts as a coordination platform and a mechanism for the exchange of information, analysis, design, and joint development of the roadmap, as well as supporting the implementation of the IRIS in Ukraine. This was a collaborative approach through the International Recommendations Working Group, and this shows the importance of maintaining an exclusive platform for the discussion of these topics and in order to identify next steps. The membership includes the government organizations and departments listed here, as well as in-country partners, other international organizations and NGOs and external advisors. Most recently joining is the IDMC. So the functions of the Secretariat are performed by the State Statistics Service of Ukraine and IOM. And this paper was drafted with contributions from this membership of the Technical Working Group, and I'd like to thank all of the members for their contributions. I'd also just like to say a quick special thanks to Elena Shevtsova from the State Statistics Service of Ukraine. So the paper covers the various different thematic areas that Natalia mentioned in her presentation. And I'm going to briefly run over these. The paper is more than 20 pages in length, so I'm just going to go through the points fairly rapidly. It will be available, the paper, in about 2 weeks for you to read fully, but we were looking to solicit feedback before we finalize the paper. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The definition of an IDP in Ukraine's legislation. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the next slide. Thank you. So the definition of an IDP in Ukraine's legislation largely corresponds to that provided in the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which predates the definition provided in the IRIS, although given that that's also based on the Guiding Principles, it largely reflects this. And the law of Ukraine entitled On Ensuring Rights and Freedoms of Internally Displaced Persons states that a person must be registered with the government of Ukraine to receive IDP status. Therefore, the fact of being registered as an IDP, rather than the definition, forms the basis of those counted in the official statistics. Furthermore, some of those registered as IDPs are residents of non-government controlled areas, otherwise known as NGCA, in Ukraine, and who are not therefore actually displaced, but are compelled to register as a displaced person if they wish to access pensions and welfare payments from the government of Ukraine. So to the next slide, please. Categories of IDPs. While the categorization of IDPs outlined in the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers provided here, with full title here, is not inconsistent with that outlined in the IRIS. It is more legally specific about which categories of persons are exclusively eligible. And this is based upon their residency in national legislation and international law in the case of stateless persons. Due to these requirements, many people with residence registration in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts or in Crimea who never experienced displacement were forced to register as IDPs in order to access rights as citizens of Ukraine. And this has somewhat distorted statistics on displacement because the total number registered does not equal the total number of people actually displaced. Currently, therefore, there's no legally based categorization for IDPs and IDP-related groups in Ukraine. And therefore, these distinct groupings cannot be identified in the official statistics, nor can they be in information systems that are available. Could we go to the next slide, please? Now, the concepts of usual residence and habitual residence need to be differentiated and therefore clearly defined for statistical purposes. And the analytical paper discusses this in some depth. There are numerous and varying definitions for each term in both national and international legal instruments. And the paper discusses and compares the definitions and usage of these and related terms in the IRIS with those in national and international, in domestic legislation in Ukraine, as well as in international legal instruments. These issues need further exploration and discussion among relevant bodies, the paper argues. And the paper suggests that it would be helpful if both of these terms were clearly defined for their usage in legislation, policy, and practice in Ukraine, and that the definitions were in line, it suggests, with international standards and practice as enshrined in the IRIS would be a good way forward. Could we go to the next slide, please? The Interagency Standing Committee framework on durable solutions for IDPs, the YASC framework, provides a definition of when a durable solution has been achieved. The YASC framework also lists 8 criteria that are used to identify and measure progress towards durable solutions. And these criteria serve as a starting point for determining such characteristics in a given context. However, the paper recognizes that in practice, the operationalization of these 8 criteria through the use of statistics and measuring whether, when, and to what extent a durable solution has been achieved is challenging. Moreover, the application of these criteria in practice varies a great deal around the world. Some systematic analysis of the vulnerabilities of IDPs in comparison with the wider population in Ukraine using similar criteria would be a very valuable exercise. So, no official statistics are available in Ukraine that relate to the needs of IDPs or their levels of integration in Ukraine. In 2017, the Cabinet of Ministers approved the Strategy on Integration of IDPs and Implementation of Durable Solutions to Internal Displacement in 2020, which that legislation has been replaced with another one subsequently. And in pursuance of this was a strategy in 2018 that related to an action plan for the period up to 2020. And among the tasks outlined in the action plan were, first, the development of criteria for assessing the integration of IDPs into their host territorial communities, and in particular, based on practical and strategic gender needs of persons and key performance indicators. And secondly, monitoring the progress of integration of IDPs into host territorial communities and assessing their needs, including gender and age-based analysis and including specific categories such as persons with disabilities. In accordance with the action plan for 2018 to the Ministry for Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine developed the first version of the so-called criteria for assessing the integration of IDPs into host territorial communities. The document outlines 10 criteria for assessing the integration of IDPs into host communities and methods for collecting, processing, and analysing data. The document calls for additional consultations. This is the analytical paper. It calls for additional consultations to identify and harmonise indicators in partnership with key stakeholders, including government and non-governmental organisations, as well as representatives of IDP and host communities. In addition, a detailed data collection methodology is yet to be developed. In July 2020, the MTOP, the Ministry for Reintegration, and the Danish Refugee Council began working collaboratively to define indicators to be able to measure the extent to which the criteria had been met. And this work was carried out within the framework of the project called Initiative to Support the Integration of IDPs in Ukraine, with financial support from the Democratic Governance East programme, the DG East. As a result, the criteria developed by the Ministry of Reintegration were refined, operationalised, and partially tested. Based upon this work, the guidelines were developed in the third quarter of 2021 for the implementation of state monitoring of the integration of IDPs into territorial host communities. Could we go to the next slide, please, on data sources? Thanks. Each of the types of data sources that are identified in the Ministry of Reintegration were refined, operationalised, and partially tested. Based upon this work, the guidelines were developed in the third quarter of 2021 for the implementation of state monitoring of the integration of IDPs into territorial host communities. Could we go to the next slide, please, on data sources? Thanks. Each of the types of data sources that are identified in the IRIS are employed in Ukraine to facilitate the collection of information that relates to IDPs. During meetings of the technical working group, it was established that some additional data sources could potentially be used for the purposes of official statistics on IDPs in Ukraine. For example, the Pension Fund of Ukraine has a centralized database of people receiving pensions, including IDPs, and information on the accrual of such benefits. The State Migration Service collects information in relation to the citizens of Ukraine who permanently reside in the non-government controlled areas and arrive in the territory controlled by the government of Ukraine, who cross from the so-called NGCA into the GCA, the government controlled areas, for the purposes of registration or reissuance of documents that allow them to receive government provided services. Could we move to the next slide, please? The IRIS defines a list of variables and tabulations that correlate to the various categories of persons in the statistical framework on displacement. These variables and tabulations provide quantitative and qualitative information about IDPs and IDP-related populations in locations of displacement, locations of return, and other settlement locations. The analytical paper provides a detailed comparison of variables and tabulations of IRIS with variables and tabulations of sources of official statistics in Ukraine, notably the Unified Information Database on IDPs, which is a repository hosted by the Ministry of Social Policy. The paper concludes that overall, the collection of data by official sources in Ukraine in relation to IDPs is comprehensive and encompasses those variables and tabulations set out in the IRIS. Coordination. Could we have the next slide, please? Thanks. In Ukraine, 3 separate central executive authorities are currently engaged in collating, managing, and utilising the information related to IDPs, as well as the coordination of the government's response. While extensive work has been done in terms of collecting statistics on IDPs in Ukraine since 2014, the paper argues that a coordination body is perhaps needed that could be responsible for producing harmonized official statistics in relation to internal displacement. Alternatively, an efficient mechanism of coordination among stakeholders could be developed. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the paper makes a series of recommendations. I think we currently are at about 14 recommendations. I'm just going to highlight 8. So in no particular order of importance, the paper suggests prioritizing recommendations that make best use of existing systems, such as clearly reporting of data that is already produced, and looking to options for adjusting existing systems, such as IDP inclusion of questions in planned census or household surveys for better solutions analysis before planning entirely new surveys or other kinds of initiatives. In other words, to use what we've already got in what's already existing is in the place. It's important to collect data on IDPs that is statistically comparable with the national population in order to measure progress towards durable solutions. It would be a valuable exercise to examine the possibility of adapting one of the national data collection tools, one or more of the national data collection tools, such as the Household Living Conditions Survey of the State Statistical Service of Ukraine, for durable solutions analysis. As far as possible, these kinds of national instruments should be prioritized, and a comprehensive examination of the potential of using existing instruments would help in developing the roadmap. The forthcoming national census that's to be conducted in Ukraine represents an opportunity to compare the census data collected with the database on IDPs hosted by the Ministry of Social Policy, which would facilitate identification of any inclusion-exclusion errors in relation to IDP statistics. Ideally, this would encompass questions capturing the migration history of respondents. This would also facilitate the disaggregation of IDP stock into geographic and thematic substocks, as well as reporting on basic classificatory variables, such as number of times individuals have been displaced, which would be difficult to capture otherwise. Ideally, the survey instrument should cover all 10 indicators needed for the IRS solutions measure. The technical working group could possibly provide technical advice and input into the development of the questionnaire, the paper suggests. Additional data sources could potentially be used for the purposes of official statistics on IDPs in Ukraine. For example, as has already been mentioned, the Pension Fund of Ukraine has a centralized database of people receiving pensions, including IDPs, and information on the accrual of such benefits. However, the Pension Fund does not collect information about the physical receipt of pension benefits by IDPs, nor on the time and place of receipt. Oshad Bank could potentially be a useful source of this information. It may be instructive to engage with the Ministry of Digital Transformation to learn more about the government of Ukraine's experience in the use of big data and how it may be used to strengthen the production of official statistics generally. So, number 5. In collaboration with EGRIS Subgroup 3, the technical working group could explore how Ukraine might conduct systematic analysis of the vulnerabilities of IDPs in comparison with the wider population in Ukraine, based upon IRIS criteria. This would facilitate the development of indicators to measure the overcoming of displacement-related vulnerabilities. This, in turn, would enhance our understanding of what represents a durable solution in the Ukrainian context and when this has been achieved. Furthermore, there is a need for a government-endorsed definition of a durable solution in the Ukrainian context, which is based upon international norms and principles. Number 6. Varying understandings and definitions for usual and habitual place of residence are used in normative legal acts of Ukraine in the context of displacement. It would be helpful if both of these terms were clearly defined for their usage in legislation, policy, and practice in Ukraine, and these definitions were in line with international standards and practice, as enshrined in the IRIS. And perhaps the technical working group could propose a definition that would be helpful to use in the context of displacement in Ukraine. Next, consider perhaps the technical working group and the wider stakeholders could consider inviting the State Emergency Service of Ukraine to participate in the technical working group as one of the government organizations represented. The state emergency services are responsible for responding and reporting on natural or human-made disasters and may have data on evacuations and housing destruction, which could help contribute towards estimates on displacement flows, notably new displacements. Finally, if the technical working group does not have the capacity to map out what is available on disaster displacement data, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, the IDMC, now a member of the technical working group, has offered to prepare a short report which could contribute towards enhancing our understanding in this regard, such as on the type and scope of information available from the state emergency services of Ukraine and the way this data could be used for the purposes of IDP statistics, etc. This, could we go to the next slide, please? This brings my presentation to an end. I'm sorry if I had to ramble through that quickly, but there's a lot to cover in only 15 minutes. So as I said, the paper will be available in about 2 weeks. We would welcome suggestions and comments. And thank you for your attention. And thank you to Roman. Both of our contact details are here if you would like to get in touch with us directly. Thanks again.
Thank you, Sean, for such a cognitive, informative, and perfect presentation of the outcomes of our analytic group work. And thank to all our team members and representatives from IOM. At this, our presentation is ended, and we move to our next session, which will be dealing with topical presentations, certain aspects that were highlighted in the IRIS. And I'm very glad to introduce our next panelist, Miss Anastasia Fitizeva. She's an advisor of the project on durable solutions of Danish Council on Refugees and IDPs. I want to thank Danish Council on Refugees in Ukraine for active participations in our working group. And as Mr. Sean mentioned in his presentation, that Danish Council has experienced joint projects with Ministry of Reintegration on developing criteria of how to evaluate integration of IDPs in Ukraine. And so we welcome Ms. Anastasia on how these solutions can be implemented on the example of Georgia and Serbia.
Good morning, everyone. Let me share the screen with my presentation. Okay, I hope you can see it. Okay, first of all, thank you very much to organizers who invited me to this very interesting and very important for Ukraine event. DRC Ukraine is one of the members of working group on IRIS implementation in Ukraine. And at one of the last meetings of this working group, when we again discussed the problematic situation with IDP registry and with IDP target possible census survey in Ukraine, we were requested to present the results of our last desk research on the best international practices on IDP's integration criteria and indicators, with particular attention to IDP statistics compiling in Georgia and Serbia. I would like to start my presentation with I will not only present like general situation with IDP statistics in Georgia and Serbia. I would like to present the key takeaways in IDP statistics compiling from the perspective of Ukraine. And before I go to the Georgia and Serbia's experiences, I would like to briefly present you the work and research which were behind of this presentation. DRC Ukraine, and particularly cross-border capacity building program of DRC Ukraine, has been started to work on this topic from mid-2020. Basically, we have been supported the Ministry for Integration of Temporarily Occupied Territories in developing criteria and indicators of IDP's integration. And in order to develop the guidelines on IDP's integration criteria and indicators, which would outline the criteria, the measurable indicators, as well as possible approaches to data collection, we have conducted two research. First, desk research, best international practices on IDP's integration criteria and indicators, which outlined the situation with IDP statistics in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Serbia. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, we tried to present this experience to receive some takeaways for Ukraine. Therefore, Ukraine's situation with IDP statistics was also analyzed. And the second research was field research. And we have conducted 30 consultation meetings with different stakeholders, as well as 12 focus group discussions with IDPs and the representatives of host communities in order to, again, rediscuss IDP's integration criteria, define IDP's integration indicators, and to discuss, first of all, with experts, the possible approaches to data collection. So based on this two research, we have developed the concept note. First of all, it was a draft concept note or guidelines on IDP's integration criteria. Then it was discussed with different stakeholders again. And now we have the final version of these guidelines on IDP's integration criteria and indicators, which was developed through the comprehensive consultative process and engagement of international expertise. At this slide, you see the cover of the desk research, which I mentioned, and on which I will base my presentation on experiences of Georgia and Serbia. This research is publicly available at the website reliefweb.int. And as I mentioned, it covers the Ukraine situation with IDP statistics. It has a consolidated review of the situation with IDP statistics in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Serbia. It also has some recommendations to the MRTOT, to the government of Ukraine, on further development, improvement of IDP's integration criteria, as well as improvement of IDP statistics. And so let's begin with international experiences. So at the beginning of my presentation, sorry, I heard my voice. Okay, so let's start with IDP's international experiences with IDP statistics. And as you remember at the beginning, I said that I will present these international experiences from the perspective of Ukraine. So I would like to bring to your attention two key problems with IDPs and statistics in Ukraine, which can be summarized as follows. First is the lack of accurate data on IDPs. It's well known that the official IDP statistics on IDPs is not accurate, and the data that we have according to the Ministry of Social Policy in Ukraine is not really accurate. The 1.5 million IDPs It's about registered IDPs. And at the same time, we know that, for example, international organizations estimate the IDPs and the number of IDPs is twice lower than its, the factual number of IDPs is twice lower than the number of IDPs reported by the Ministry of Social Policy. Yeah. Probably you know the reason, and the reason is that many NGCA residents need to be registered as IDPs in order to receive access to pensions, to social payments, and different state services. The second problem is lack of state-led initiatives for data collection on IDPs' needs and their vulnerabilities. Yeah, as Sean mentioned, in Ukraine, there is no state initiatives which would collect data on IDPs integration and IDPs needs. And all the data that we have about IDPs needs at this stage is collected by humanitarian organizations. Yeah. So let's move to Georgia and Serbia. Well, first of all, why we decided to choose Georgia and Serbia. Both countries are quite similar to Ukraine in terms of their geopolitical contexts. Both countries encountered internal displacement problems in 90s, which was related to the post-socialist transformation and collapse of large state formations. The Soviet Union, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and at that times, I mean, at 90s, the humanitarian organizations had only started focusing on problems of protection of IDPs' rights, which were later enshrined in international instruments. And you know that according to the UN Guiding Principle on International Displacement, and the durable solutions for IDPs are achieved as soon as IDPs have overcome all challenges related to displacement. Therefore, one of the key recommendations related to IDP statistics in international documents is that the governments need to monitor the situation of IDPs, and that's why the IASC framework was developed and the criteria to monitor this situation was developed. But in Serbia and in Georgia, we could observe the same situation as we have now in Ukraine, as both countries either omitted or considered only partially these recommendations, these international recommendations. At the same time, both countries have progressed much further than Ukraine, and therefore, let's look at their best practices and lessons learned. I would like to bring to your attention 2 points that are related to the sources of data. First is about administrative data and use of IDP registries. And second is about censuses and surveys. Let's start with IDPs, registries, and administrative data. If we look at Georgia's experience, we will see that Georgia, as Ukraine, established a formal IDP status. It means that every IDPs who wants, as in Ukraine, in Georgia, can receive the document which certifies that this person was displaced. Actually, these documents make a person eligible for different payments and services for IDPs. Therefore, all statistics on IDPs, stocks and flows in Georgia are also based on the registration of IDPs. So all people which were registered as IDPs are considered as IDPs. This is the same as in Ukraine. There were some problems with accuracy of this data based on the IDP registration. And in 2013-2014, the government of Georgia has decided to carry out the mandatory re-registration exercise of all IDPs, meaning that all IDPs needed to come to check-in points and re-register their status. And it was quite successful exercise because it enabled the government of Georgia to update the database of IDPs and also collect information on their needs. What we have in Serbia? Well, in Serbia, there is no formal IDP status, which is actually aligned with international recommendations, as IDPs are the citizens of the country and they don't need to have special status to have access to some services. But in Serbia, there is the Registry of Vulnerable IDP Household, which was established in 2013. And this registry includes only those IDPs who are considered as vulnerable. There are some criteria of vulnerability which were established with support of UNHCR. And as soon as the IDPs have overcome problems related to displacement, which is monitored as per this criteria, they are not considered as vulnerable IDPs, and the government don't need to support them. It's a completely different approach in comparison with Georgia. Now let's look at the second point. Let's look at the use of censuses and state surveys in Georgia and Serbia. As you can see, both countries have conducted censuses, but in Georgia, the last census conducted in 2014, it also included the IDP identification question, which enabled the government to collect data on IDPs numbers and their characteristics based on census. The main challenge was related to the discrepancy between administrative data, which were collected after the re-registration exercise and based on the census. In Serbia, census conducted in 2011, the IDP statistics based on this census is not available. However, the next scheduled census for this year should include IDP identification questions. So we are looking forward to this data. Regarding the state sample surveys, and particularly the regular state sample surveys, like labor force survey, for example, there are some challenges in both countries because, for example, in Georgia, the IDP identification questions were included into these sample surveys. However, considering that IDPs lives in compact settlements, there was a problem to ensure the representativity of this data for IDPs. Therefore, this data is not analyzed and is not published. In Serbia, such data also is not published. In both countries, there were survey, which is called multiple indicator cluster survey, which is unregular survey for most sensitive group of population. There were separate surveys for IDPs. And therefore, both countries have representative data on IDPs based on this target target survey, which also covered IDPs. So, and I will go to my last slide about the key takeaways for Ukraine. I divided it for two points, which I mentioned at the beginning. So first problem for Ukraine was accurate data on IDPs, and second problem was nationally owned solutions for the data collection on IDPs' needs and their vulnerabilities. And let's look at the takeaways. Regarding the accurate data on IDPs, first of all, mandatory registration exercise for all IDPs, as was in Georgia, could be considered as a possible solutions for cleaning the data in the unified database on IDPs in Ukraine. At least we can consider it. Second point is related to the approach of the compiling the data on IDP stocks and flows. And unless there is no political will to reduce IDP stock based on the monitoring of IDPs and vulnerabilities, which we observe in Ukraine now, IDP stocks and flow statistics in Ukraine will be based only on registration of the fact of displacement. Next takeaways about the state-led initiatives for data collection on IDPs needs. First takeaway is about the regular state sample survey. Of course, we can add IDP identification questions to labor force survey or to household living conditions survey, but it will not be sufficient to obtain accurate data on IDPs needs due to the challenges related to sampling and representativity. However, we, of course, can pilot the target IDP survey. And we, of course, would be happy to receive and to obtain the data from the census, from the next round of census. And it would be the most relevant scenario for data collection on IDPs in Ukraine. So from my side, it's over. Thank you very much.
Дуже дякуємо вам, пані Анастасія.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, for very important presentation from the point of view of research of the practices, best practices. And in the light of that, the experience of Georgia and Serbia is quite relevant, and we had a possibility to learn from those practices. And now we move all participants. I want to remind you, before we move forward, please ask your questions in Zoom chat, in our Facebook page, to our distinguished panelists, and we will have Q&A sessions and discuss those issues. And for having the fruitful discussion, please join with your questions. From the session that is devoted to the best practices of registration of IDPs. This is very important part of IRIS. And I want to introduce our longtime partners, Ms. Anastasia from the Statistics and Data Analysis Office of UNHCR. And a lot of you know her from our last year webinar on international UN recommendations for IDPs registration. She was a AGRIS coordinator at her previous job position. And thank Aina for participating this year too. And Ms. Hisham Halal, he's an expert on statistics and data analytics from the Regional Bureau of Latin America in the UNHCR. They will have a presentation from the UNHCR and IDP registration challenges and opportunities. And I want to emphasize a very good cooperation between UNHCR office in Ukraine and State Statistics Bureau, and the role of the UNHCR statistics in the data management and in their mission of protecting vulnerable groups. Aina, Hisham, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Olena, for the introduction, and thank you for having us. It's a real pleasure to be here. Before diving into the discussion, I think I wanted to just commend Ukraine a bit on their achievements. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I think you have been on a immense journey over the past couple of years, and Ukraine has also adopted the IDP inclusion and durable solution strategy and operational plan. This is valid until 2024. And if there is an interest in the group, UNHCR led by Hisham has done a preliminary mapping of the strategy to the solutions measure in IRIS and also to SDG. So we will be happy to share this after the call if there is an interest. As mentioned by many partners, Ukraine has had a very strong involvement in IGRIS, both at the working group level, but also in the steering committee, and this has been very appreciated. There is also, as we know, this country level working group established, which doesn't only include international community and governments, but also have civil society and communities, which I think is very much appreciated. And of course, the analytical paper that we're here to discuss today, and also gathering the best practice experience from partners is very valuable. There is also these exploration of these opportunities to include IDPs in census and household service, and I think that is also very promising and shows the strong commitment from Ukraine to the IRIS implementation, but also to IDP statistics in general. Next slide, please. So how can UNHCR support you in, one slide back, please. So how can UNHCR support you in this work? If you just go one slide back. UNHCR support role. Yeah, thank you. So how can UNHCR support you in this work? Related to technical support and capacity building, as you probably already know, we have strong expertise in the area of IDPs, data and statistics. We're also the lead in law and policy development on IDPs. We're supporting partners in their country engagement. We've supported GIPS profiling in Ukraine, for example, and we do similar work in other countries. And as Olena mentioned, and thank you, we have also a very strong collaboration with Statistics Ukraine through deployment via Statistics Norway, but also direct collaboration. UNHCR is also the protection lead agency and should be involved from a protection perspective in IDP data collection in any form. Related to coordination and facilitation of support, like Ukraine, UNHCR is also a key member of IGRIS at steering committee level, but also leading the secretariat, as well as being lead of the subgroup 2 on capacity building, and we stand ready to support. We're also available to exchange and include discussions on data. We're ready to support peer-to-peer learning. I'm very happy to see both Georgia and Serbia being presented in this meeting, and also having that collaboration between countries in the region. We're also ready to support peer-to-peer learning between regions, as we have this global outreach, and also happy and pleased to have Hisham, my colleague from the Americas, involved in this work and involved in this meeting, as they are embarking on similar exercises in that region that I'm sure there will be lessons learned. UNHCR is also available to support participatory approaches and making sure that IDP communities are involved in the work, both in defining prioritization, but also criteria for services, and if need be, setting up complaint mechanisms. Next slide, please. So UNHCR is involved in IDP enrollment, and it's seen as a very useful tool for UNHCR to enable UNHCR, but also partners, to provide household or individual level protection, case management, camp management, assistance delivery, assistance tracking, and assistance coordination. But it's not seen as a tool to produce population statistics per se. It's not seen as a tool to produce socioeconomic data or to provide legal status, but not to undermine. It's really useful in data management, for data management purposes. In a UNHCR context, it's also limited to specific and predefined purposes, and very importantly, would need to comply with the principles and standards outlined in the UNHCR data protection policy. This should also apply to national governments that in most contexts would also need to follow data protection standards developed at national level. Before embarking on a IDP enrollment exercise, there's a number of considerations to make. And I've tried to list them all here in this slide, but I'll run through them. Nature and phase of the situation, the operating environment, for UNHCR, also the role and information needs, protection risk associated with the collection and analysis and sharing and storage of the data, also other available resources, what type of assistance is to be provided, the profile of the population, and also the whole displacement situation itself. Is it stable? Is it volatile, etc.? The role of governments needs to be considered, and also how the government is involved in the provision of assistance. I've tried to summarize these considerations along 3 headings. So a discussion around availability of data. Is there data in other data sources, or is IDP enrollment and this way the only way to go? What are the protection risks? Is the need to do a protection analysis upfront before embarking on the IDP enrollment? Also, what is the access to IDPs? How easy are they to access and to actually get the data from this population? And also importantly, how easy is it to keep the data up to date? Is this a very fluid and volatile situation? So will the data quickly be outdated? And last but not least, mentioned by many other colleagues already, the whole coordination aspect. Who are the partners that need to be involved from government, from national, regional, and global level, etc. Next slide. Please. So IDP enrollment is one of 3 main approaches to IDP population data management. Another approach is estimation. This is used, for example, to calculate approximate population size and characteristics. And a third one would be profiling, which, as probably most of you know, provide a more detailed information on demographic characteristics and also on needs and capacities of the populations. These can either be used in isolation or complementary. It really depends on the purpose of the exercise and also the outcome that you want. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages on all of these. I'm not going to go into that here, but it's related to accuracy, cost, etc. But just to reiterate that IDP enrollment, and we're even given it a different name than we have for refugee registration, is really meant to serve the purpose of enabling provision of assistance, protection, and services. Unlike for refugee registration, IDP enrollment is not linked to the of legal status, and ideally not used to obtain population figures, because it doesn't give a comprehensive picture of the whole population in question. IRIS is recommending inclusion of IDPs in national censuses and household surveys, but do recognize that registries can be important administrative data sources along with censuses and household surveys, but should not be established for the sole purpose of producing statistics, but when established, should include as much information as possible. And this is where I pause and give the floor over to Hisham, who will talk more about IDP registries and official statistics and pros and cons in that area. Over to you, Hisham. Thank you.
Thanks, Aina. If you could, and hi everyone, good morning. If you could please move the presentation to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So basically, I think what we want to highlight is that Ukraine is in a privileged position. You're building on the experiences of several other countries who've already established IDP-specific registries, and you're building on the lessons learned and best practices that are already in existence. So we're lucky that we're not starting from scratch. But it also gives us an opportunity to reflect on the pros and cons and basically the positives and negatives from the experiences of the other countries and how those challenges can be addressed in the Ukrainian context. Before delving into that, maybe one thing we need to look at is the question of what is the exact purpose that the IDP registry was set up for, and before we even look at its adequacy for the production of IDP statistics. There are multiple angles for looking at IDP registration. One of them is obviously the statistical purpose. As Aina had just mentioned, IRIS does not recommend that countries set up IDP registries specifically for statistical purposes, but where they do exist, they may be a highly valuable source. But more often than not, IDP registries are set up specifically for the provision and targeting of assistance. And in that case, the question becomes how reflective is the population that is included in these assistance programs of the broader IDP population. And finally, the IDP registries may be set up, as in several other countries, for the purpose of establishing transitional justice and reparation measures in acknowledgement of the historical challenges that IDPs have suffered and gone through. And depending on why the IDP registry was set up, it may or may not be suitable for other purposes. It's not just because there's an IDP registry that automatically it should be fully useful for the different purposes. Depending on the purpose, its purpose specific, why it was set up would influence how useful it is for the other users. And this is something that we'll come to in the next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I think the pros of using IDP registration have been greatly extolled in different presentations and other places. They're low cost since it's ongoing data collection. It doesn't really cost anything to use them for the production of official statistics where they've already been set up for assistance or reparation. The data is updated on a continuous basis, so there's no additional cost to Statistics Ukraine for using that information. IDP registries may also serve as sampling frames when you want to run a statistically representative sample by either providing an individual sampling frame, meaning you have the direct contacts and identities of the internally displaced persons, or it may give you an area sampling frame, basically, which tells you where to find IDPs in the national territory so you can go and survey them. The third and maybe one of the strongest advantages of administrative data is that it could be easily linked through different government agencies. So for example, you may have an IDP registry which is maintained for the sole purpose of providing assistance to IDPs directly, but by linking persons using common identifiers like a national ID or a passport number with databases from the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, ministries of other sectors, basically, you could get a bit more comprehensive idea about what level do IDPs have when it comes to access to government services and processes. The challenge with this thing is that record linkage is often a bit beyond what works in official statistics, and many times it relies on probabilistic linking methods because the different registries either do not include the necessary common identification variables, or where they do exist, there are data protection considerations that would limit data sharing between agencies, and as such, a direct linkage cannot be established. And so while it's a pro and advantage of IDP registration that you could do record linkage, in reality, we don't really see that very often in many countries. And then I think the part where I wanted to focus most of the presentation actually is on the disadvantages and the downsides of IDP registration. One issue that's always been highlighted when working in out-of-camp contexts is that IDP registration tends to underrepresent the population, particularly because people need to come forward to register. In camp-based contexts where all IDPs are easily accessible, you could simply run the equivalent of a census inside the camp and register everyone. But if you're in an out-of-camp setting, you rely on the people coming forward. But then there are a lot of people who will not come forward, either because they are unwilling, meaning they do not need assistance, or they have maybe protection risks or any concerns about being registered that would complicate their situation even further. But there are also people who are unable to register, whether because of heightened levels of vulnerability, lack of information about registration processes, distance to the nearest registration service point, etc.
Just a second. I'm in a webinar. I've just done my presentation.
Please mute yourself.
Yeah, well, it's going on in the background as long as I don't get asked any questions.
No worries, Oana. Thanks. Yeah, so that was the point on undercoverage. On overcoverage, a lot of times IDP registries also accumulate craft because, sorry, Sheen, if you could hear us, if you could please mute yourself, or if somebody could text Sheen. Anyways. On the issue of overcoverage, IDP registries tend to accumulate craft because, you know, IDPs, they may pass away. Some people may have emigrated outside the country, but then the other family members or maybe the authorities wouldn't even be notified of that event in a proper time. So the IDP registry would inflate the number of people who are actually still within the stock, within the country. The same goes also for this whole issue of registration of non-displaced persons. As we all know, and as presented earlier in the presentation on the analytical work paper and background, Ukraine doesn't, the Ukrainian laws do not distinguish between children born in displacement and children who have been displaced, but IRIS requires this distinction, and at the same time, it's not possible to have that, even if it's not in law, but you cannot even have it from an IDP registry unless you have proper identification variables for every single individual within the registry. But what happens more often than not is because assistance is targeted at a household level, you end up registering children born in displacement, other family members, persons, for example, as mentioned earlier, who are not even displaced but need to be registered to be able to access pensions and assistance. And all these people, they inflate, in a way, the size of the IDP population in the country. A third downside of IDP registration actually is the need for durable solutions, and this is one of the key areas that IRIS, as well as the Interagency Standing Committee Framework on Durable Solutions, try to emphasize, which is that we need not only think of IDPs as displaced persons, but we also need to be a bit long-term and forward-thinking in trying to identify when does this displacement end. And according to both IRIS, building on the Interagency Standing Committee Framework on Durable Solutions, end of displacement is not based on the physical location of the person. It's not just because they return that they are no longer IDPs, or if they have settled elsewhere, etc. It's really about the well-being and conditions of that population. And to be able to measure this well-being, you need two things. One is socioeconomic data on the IDP population, and two is comparable socioeconomic indicators on the general national population. Obviously, administrative data, especially when it's set up for assistance targeting, etc., would not capture this kind of socioeconomic indicators. And a lot of the socioeconomic indicators required to measure the well-being of IDPs cannot be properly captured through administrative data sources, even if they were intentionally designed for that. And then even when they are included, because the comparable data produced for the national population is usually coming from national household surveys, the data often has comparability issues, whether in terms of the wording of the questions, the methodology, etc. So it really misses a very important opportunity for us to be able to identify when have people overcome the displacement-related vulnerabilities. I'm always reminded not to use the word end of displacement. And then one final issue with IDP registration is really this whole commitment not to leave anyone behind. Internal displacement is a de facto situation. It's been emphasized in the guiding principles throughout country practices. And I think like even here in the webinar where it was being discussed earlier that while internal displacement is a de facto situation, the counting of who is displaced and services to those who are displaced are based on registration, which means that we're essentially excluding some people who have displacement-related protection needs and vulnerabilities from being counted as IDPs and even from accessing state services. And this is one of the founding principles or foundational principles of the whole SDG inclusion agenda. Next slide, please. On how to move forward from here. In the assessment of data sources presented by IRIS in Chapter 6, Part E, it basically highlights that household surveys are the most flexible data source for the production of IDP statistics, but that does not mean that we should neglect or avoid use of IDP registration, censuses, or other possible sources. There are basically two sets of recommendations where you can divide the 4 bullet points you see in front of you now to 2 main pillars. One is make sure that any data source that could be used for the production of IDP statistics includes both indicators for identifying those who are displaced and then those who have overcome the displacement-related vulnerabilities. And please bear in mind that because IDPs, unlike refugees, it is not a legal status per se, and the end of displacement, just like displacement itself, is a de facto situation. The identification of the end of displacement is part of the identification of internally displaced populations, meaning that it's not sufficient that a data source would include the identification questions for who has been displaced. It's equally important for the same data source to include the questions and indicators required to identify those who should no longer count as internally displaced for statistical purposes. And that brings us to the second group of pillars or recommendations on the way forward, which is how do we measure this whole issue of overcoming the displacement-related vulnerabilities. Currently, in the Inclusion and Durable Solutions Strategy for 2024, there's a group of key performance indicators that are more focused on processes that evidence the government's commitment and progress towards improving the conditions of internally displaced persons, but perhaps they don't really capture the outcomes and the impact on IDPs' lives and their progress towards the achievement of durable solutions. And since IRIS is grounded in the SDG framework, the obvious thing is that we would need to complement these key performance indicators with indicators from the SDGs that speak to people's well-being, basically, across the different strategic objectives that were established in the Inclusion and Durable Solution Strategy, as well as additional criteria from the Interagency Solution Standing Committee's Durable Framework for Durable Solutions for IDPs, and the IRIS, which basically highlights key criteria that need to be assessed when measuring the end of displacement. Where possible, we should, as much as possible, refer to the SDGs in these measurements for a simple reason. I was earlier just now saying that the definition of an IDP is not just about who's been displaced, it's also about who's no longer displaced. So if you were to align the definition of who is displaced in Ukraine with the IRIS definition, but then there were to be a national definition of the end of displacement, it would still mean that the definition of an IDP in Ukraine is not aligned with the international definition of IDPs or how IDPs are estimated and reported in the other countries. And this is a very important issue. So as much as possible, aligning with the SDGs, which is basically the same framework that's used globally for national, as well as displaced populations, ensures that the definition of who has overcome the displacement-related challenges as per the IRIS methodology ensures that you're producing outflow statistics that are compatible across countries. And whatever possible, I think this would be a bit more of a general recommendation, not specific to IDP registries, but where possible, countries should try to make IDPs visible in the voluntary national reporting on SDGs. And the way this ties into the whole discussion on IDP registration is that if the government is already producing statistics on, for example, poverty, unemployment, safety and security, etc., from national household surveys, then the direction should be as much as possible to make sure that IDP statistics are also coming from these very same sources so that you're able to provide comparable data for them in the voluntary national reporting to make them more visible in official statistics, as opposed to setting up a parallel system for reporting on internal displacement. And this basically concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I will be with you until the end of the day if there are any additional questions or anything. Thanks, and over.
Thank you very much, Ain. Thank you very much, Hisham, for joining us today, for your extremely valuable asset and for your precious inputs, which should be taken, of course, into account while working further on the development of the roadmap of IRIS implementation in Ukraine.
And I'm glad to welcome our next speaker, Mr. Vladko Abramovsky, expert on population movement and population mobility of IOM, and he will present us how this transition between the operational data to the registration of IDPs is happening. Vladko is a guru, and he's well-known mechanism of IOM mechanism, which is called DTM, global system that is collecting data on relocation and the needs on the relocated population that suffered from natural disasters or conflicts. Since 2004, DTM is present in 78 countries. And Mr. Vladko, the floor is yours, and thank you for participating.
Yes, hello. Thank you for inviting us to present. I will try a bit to give some practical examples of the data collection that we are doing and the links with between operational data and IDP registration, as we see in DTM. We'll try to give you a bit of overview of the internal displacement data that we collect, and then how we treat, from location level, group level key informants to individual level data in IDPs, and some IDP registration country experience that we have, and we'll touch a bit of safeguarding of IDP data. Just in brief, displacement tracking matrix, the programs on data collection that IOM implements are active in many countries. Currently, there were 78, most recent, but operations vary, depends on the need and the appearance of different human mobility and displacement and migration events. Considering IDPs, we are active in 30 countries, actively collecting data, which has natural disaster and conflict context or both. Just briefly on the purpose on DTM, that is outlined in our internal displacement data strategies to strengthen the capacity and leadership in human mobility data and support, the mobile populations in need, inform humanitarian peace and development, contributes to assistance and protection data, and what is most important, provides estimates of displacement, return, and migration flows, depends on the exercise. Also to coordinate the data activities, within the different forums of humanitarian actors, governments, etc. Use and accountability of the data through different innovations and capacity building, partnership with academic and research institutions, focus on safeguards and standards. So all of it is outlined in internal displacement data strategy. You can use the links later with the presentation that will be probably provided by the organizer. Well, DTM, let's demystify a little bit DTM. It's consists of different exercises, that are, designed, to collect data. Let's take example on IDPs in this situation, but also can be different population groups. Mobility tracking, that is on a location level through key informants, establish the best estimate of the available data and what is the best estimate through interviewing key informants of the presence of population in that particular location. Flow monitoring, where we have a high mobility and then people moving from one to another place, estimate, different flows and number of people and characteristics in those flows. So both of them are, what you see on top are on group level with majority key informants or direct, counts. While registration is more census-like, it's an individual level that is applied in some countries, and of course, variety of sample surveys that are based for different population groups. So there are these different, as we call them, different components, which all relate to different exercises of data collection. Would like to draw a little bit of connection between the mobility tracking and the estimate of number of individuals, reasons for displacement, time of displacement, and type of locations where displaced populations are, which is collected on a location level. Once the area is defined, locations are identified by visiting of those locations or collecting the best available data. Best estimates are collected and processed that gives opportunity to map and to present, the extent of displacement and people in different locations. It contains, with the different steps of defining the area, then defining the population groups, and then identifying the locations and collecting the best available data. And this gives an idea of the current extent of the displacement, and this is basically what everybody asks in the beginning of the event when displacement is happening. How many people are displaced, where they are, etc. They are, of course, in different contexts, from moving from the location and group level, which is most common, let's say defined as operational data that is collected, to more detailed individual level of data that is collected, with registrations. For example, let's say registrations, and the registration activities itself are not necessarily implemented everywhere. Depends on the context, that it is, but requires a lot of preparations. And it goes and defining the purpose of it, you know, it involves, you know, different decisions, preparing the operation, the registration itself, you know, the processes and the data that comes. But what is important is that, sorry for this, is that process steps are defined, and once the purpose is identified, you know, within the with the government or within the humanitarian community, it requires a bit of preparation, logistic, human resources. Then it goes to data collection and the data processing, and then produces different outputs, which is, you know, identification of the population of concern, let's say the IDPs. These are normally we heard here. May most of the times come contexts, you know, but not necessary. If it's easy identifiable, then produces household and individual registration lists and data sets, of course, the different demographic indicators and analysis of vulnerability levels. And what is very important, registrations provide reliable sampling frame for detailed IDP household surveys. And then all very often, because we'll see the next slides, you know, that it involves a lot of data sharing and use by different entities, you know, for providing assistance or etc. There are many contexts, you know, recently we work with majority where we have utilizing biometric technology because it's important for verification and authentication and avoid duplication in order to provide reliable services. There are two examples I would like to emphasize that are following this approach, like South Sudan and Nigeria, where there is a protracted displacement, conflict setting, and large number of internally displaced are registered in this system and can be easily identified. In South Sudan, the work started in 2014 with the most recent wave of displacement that happened due to internal conflict between different government fractions, and it's still ongoing. We have over 1 million records, near 1 million records for the moment, let's say, and then majority of this work it's in the camp setting, you know, or different or isolated rural communities where different displaced groups are gathered. And we have a specifically designed system that we call it BRAVE, and its majority of it is in partnership with WFP, where we have the data exchange, where then further WFP is using it for food distributions, etc. Must say that it's quite costly operation in terms of registration, but of course it has its cost benefit on the distribution and entitlements, because, you know, spending like 3 million per year, you know, so far 15 million saved hundreds of millions to WFP in the target, in the good for well-organized food distribution and proper targeting. Similar is in Nigeria, that following some successes in South Sudan, we were asked also to implement the same in Nigeria after the Boko Haram conflict in the northern states. We maintain a register of 1.9 million, you know, and currently more than half of them are IDPs, still IDPs, you know, but there are also some that returned, you know, as you can see in our other displacement reports. Currently, Nigeria has in the northern states like 2.1 million IDPs and then 1.9 million, near 1.9 million returnees. Similar, their partnership is with WFP, and then there is a lot of data exchange agreements. And what is important here is that these registrations are complementing the mobility tracking estimates that are providing the complete, you know, the picture of internal displacement and the accurate best estimated number of total internally displaced in the country. And with these registries and census-like work, we are able to derive reliable agent sex breakdowns, household compositions, etc., and also sometimes utilize it for sample surveys. Another example out of this conflict and humanitarian situation is a different humanitarian need where there are ad hoc displacements due to natural disasters, especially the typhoons in Philippines, that are very, very often in December. They are happening regularly, and that depends on the scale of displacement. There is a need to identify internally displaced, which, of course, years ago, more than 10 years, we are very active there, with mobility tracking, identifying locations and shelters, but also the need, the government saw the need of doing individual identifications, so ask us a bit, to modify our BRAVE system and then support them in managing internally displaced data, this short-term internal displacement after the typhoon. So that's also goes successfully, registering with the government, where our system is handed over to the government agencies for dealing with disasters, BSWD. Like, since I mentioned a bit BRAVE system, would like to take you through, because it takes the registration itself, and then after the registration, there is a possibility of enrollment of beneficiaries, selecting beneficiaries that are targeted, or in some situations, in the new displacement and very dire humanitarian situation, there is a blanket full coverage distributions and entitlements. It has a possibility of different authentications, biometric, barcode, and everything, and also, of course, to track distributions, but that's another subject for another discussions. There are key functionalities of the system that are easy for you to visualize. I will not spend much time on it. Like every other system, it has improvements, and it's in-house developed, and then as we learn, we develop more, and so far it's serving the purpose. What is important to bring back is that there is a need of safeguarding the IDP data in any context of the data collection, especially when we are talking about the individual data. IAM has its data governance policies that are used to manage accurate and risk-free data, then abides by the data protection principles, so I have the links there. Then, of course, we are paying much attention to ICT, to information technology, IT data security. Then also the safeguarding this partnership and very clear agreements on the use of the data, especially when individual identification is available. Then all the interagency, also safeguarding is all the interagency efforts for compliance. This means our engagement with EGRIS recommendations and be compliant in producing different statistics, which we are part of it. We work with EGRIS since the beginning, and I'm very glad that the work evolved. Since I last got in touch with it in Ankara in 2019, and then now with adopting the recommendations and implementation. And then, of course, there is always guidance and documentation of all the exercises, cities, as variety of our examples you can find on different repositories and websites. And I will encourage those who are not familiar also to take a look. If I may use just a minute, a bit to put a bit in the context of this discussion, for the Ukraine IDP statistics. What is something that is important for me is that what we heard about the de facto and de jure situation, let's put it in a census language, de facto and de jure, this habitual unusual residence, that not clear estimates can be obtained. There is a bit of work that can be done, with the databases, but also some work that can be done with the direct visiting and being present, in different locations. What I want to say, I mean, we always look at the Ukraine IDP database, and we are talking about Rayon and Oblast. That's it. But we don't talk about the village. We don't talk about the neighborhood where the IDPs are. We never present that or make people aware where the IDPs are. What I would like to see more ideas, and then how to get to the proper estimates of distribution of internally displaced, regardless of the legal definition. Let's try to use the term that we heard before. De facto IDPs, those that are really displaced, how many are present and at certain moment in time in the village or in the neighborhood. Let's bring it to Ukrainian language. We take it, so I would like to see a map with the dots where each selo and each, how to say it, microregion mista is identified. And then there is a dot on the map for the IDP presence. And this is easy to do, with utilizing the database and providing best estimates, by visiting or by consulting knowledgeable people or local authorities that are there. So, and then in comparison with the existing, legally defined IDP status, there is a good way to present, the actual displacement pattern in Ukraine. There, and I hope we will get there, slowly, because we got engaged, years ago with Ukraine displacement, and that's why in the beginning, we let it go. I mean, we supported government registration because it provided, but and then we got engaged, into the sample survey, the NMS systems, etc. But I have a feeling that a little bit we are behind of presenting the actual situation. For last 2 years, we are talking about the problems that are with this de facto de jure definitions and entitlements link, but we are not talking about how to overcome that and how to present the actual distribution of the IDPs and changes in time, which also is one of the DTM examples. If you look back into mobility tracking that is conducted in rounds, so it presents like several times a year different changes and movements. I know it's not ideal, it's not super accurate, the statisticians the offices of statistics will not agree. I would never agree to that, 20 years ago when I used to work in Office of Statistics of my country, but with the work that I see here, now and the development in the humanitarian sector, and also the attention to internal displacement and the changes in movement, sometimes, any kind of official exercises cannot provide it, so we need a bit to go to alternative methods with operational data collection and putting dots on the map to understand the internal displacement. Apologies, I took a bit of time, to add a bit of Ukrainian context in relation to DTM, but I hope it will be useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vlatko, very much for your extremely precious insight and for suggesting that very pattern that, of course, might be used. And evidently, we start we should start discussing things from practical perspective also, not only from theoretical. And thank you very much for, it seems to me that those processes and stages you described were also far more important. And this very differentiation of registration, verification, and further enrollment. Extremely informative and cognitive presentation. Thank you very much for being with us today.
And I'm glad to introduce our next speaker, because very important component and a big section of IRIS is as a survey, because as a data source. I want to introduce Mr. Oscar Rico, head of the information management and information of GIPSU, to tell us about how we identify IDPs. Various tools. We can have to say that GIPS is active member of working group in Ukraine, and they're very renowned participant of ERVIS, and GIPS is more known as the global knowledge hub on profiling. And after being established in 2009 as institutional organization to provide support to international organizations who require better analysis of the information about the IDPs at local level. And in Ukraine, GIPS works since 2014. Oscar, the floor is yours. And thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Olena, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this webinar. It's been discussed throughout this session, the importance of having mixed methods and different sources for data in context of displacement. So I would like to refer to a recent paper that GIPS worked on, which is the identification on IDPs in service. This document has been published recently and it's available in our website. GIPS is a field-focused impartial broker. We were created in 2009, and our mandate is to bring governments and international, both humanitarian and development actors together to work collaboratively to inform solutions on displacement. And we would also help governments to build capacity to inform solutions and to work towards achieving durable solutions for IDPs. Our mandate is under the supervision of our interagency executive committee. Some of the executive committee members have been also presenting today. So basically, GIPS has been supporting countries throughout the world in the past nearly 18 years. We recently have finalized one country operation in Sudan when we support the operationalizing of the humanitarian and development and peace nexus through the Peace Building Fund. And we have also supported Ukraine informing the national strategy on local integration using global standards, as it was mentioned earlier today, with the integration measure that was supported or supporting the work of the Ministry of Reintegration. The document I will refer to is the document published by GIPS a month ago, and its title is Identifying Internally Displaced Persons in Service. And it comes from a very detailed revision of 24 surveys that were mostly on household level, and they were used in 21 countries in different continents in a period of about 10 years. So the results will be handy to understand the importance of identifying IDPs in surveys, and as we have also been discussing today, the use of households to identify IDPs will be also useful to measure progress towards solutions and to also measure the local integration or the displacement related vulnerabilities of internally displaced people. So why is it important to standardize an approach for IDP identifications in surveys? So one is because by identifying IDPs in surveys, we could allow comparison across different surveys, across context, and across time. And this would also allow the comparison with host communities. It would also save time and effort for the users, as standardizing IDP identification in surveys will consolidate an insight from research and tested approaches into a solid test or into a solid set of questions. And it could also help overcome political sensitiveness that would often surround IDP identification. And here we're talking about the agreed upon definitions that IRIS presents around the concepts of IDP definition, about the concept of habitual place of residence. So by using these standard concepts, we will make sure that also we overcome this sensitiveness. The tools that we revised, they all have different approaches for identifying IDPs. Some of the questionnaires that we reviewed, they have a system of identifying IDPs based on an enumeration. So basically when this survey was conducted, the internally displaced population was already identified. Some of the tools that we revised, they have a pre-identification through registers. So as has been mentioned today, there are some good experiences on IDP registration. And in the case of Ukraine, there is one registry in place. So some of the surveys that can be implemented, they could take the baseline of the registration. But of course, there are the challenges around the registries and the fact that some of them could overestimate the number of IDPs and they lack the usefulness for measuring progress towards solution or to assess needs. And most of the surveys, they use identification modules, which can be done by self-identification, by a criteria-based approach, or using proxy indicators to understand who is an IDP. I'm going to break those down in the following slides. So basically, the self-identification approach is the one where IDPs identify themselves. So they will have to respond one specific question as being identified as IDP. What are the pros of this approach? And it's basically probably the simplest one because it allows people to self-identify and manifest their status as being an IDP, and it reduces the burden because it's just one direct question. But on the contrary side, it's really abstract, and since the concept of an IDP is based on a breakdown of different variables like being forced or obliged to leave, leaving the habitual place of residence, it could lead to misinterpretation of the concept of an IDP if we allow IDPs to self-identify. So we can fall under the risk of gathering non-reliable and non-comparable data, and it, of course, exposes to a biased response. We have some of the examples of self-identification in some of the data sets that we revised, and one of them is from Ukraine from 2020, where they used the self-identification in a household survey to identify IDPs. The second approach to identify IDPs that we also identified in some of the data sets that we and the questionnaires that we revised is the criteria-based approach. In here, then we're talking about a set of questions that are useful to categorize who is an IDP. We found good examples of household questionnaires that identified different questions to help the respondent understand if they are IDPs or not. So basically here, we could be talking about questions of what is the original place of residence, or if the person who is answering the questionnaire lives in the current place because it was forced or obliged to leave their habitual place of residence, and questions around how long the family or the household have lived in the current location, and the causes of displacement are key to understand if we're talking about for displacement. So on this criteria-based approach, a pro is that it's more concrete and precise, and it yields the objective responses. Of course, it provides detailed and quality data, and it reduces the respondent burden because it's an easy to process to understand questions that would help the respondent understand their status as an IDP. On the contrary side, this entails a higher number of questions, which is sometimes the purpose of a household survey. Of course, if we use a set of questions to identify IDPs in a census, that would be highly costly. So probably this is a very good approach to use in household surveys where we can allow more time to conduct the survey. But of course, as we add questions, it could also possibly add length to the interview and therefore respondents' burden. And finally, proxy identification, which we also found in some of the questionnaires that we revised, was the idea of finding other ways to identify IDPs. Basically here we could be talking about topics within the survey that could talk about current location, or the time that the household had lived in the current location, or aspects like mother tongue, the language spoken in the household, the type of personal documents. So basically, this is an approach that could be used when the survey is not intended mainly for IDP needs assessment, but for example, in context where there is a survey around refugees and the current needs of refugees, these proxy questions could be useful to identify if there are IDPs within the refugee population in a certain region of a country. So these are the three main approaches for IDP identification that we found. I'm going to try to give some recommendations at the end on which is the best or the more desirable approach to design a survey and to capture who could be an IDP, in either if this is in a survey to assess needs or to measure progress towards solutions. I will give these recommendations at the end of the presentation. The process for development and identify IDPs, basically we have outlined this process in the paper. The first step is the specification of information needs, and here it's very important to understand if we are doing a household survey at which measurement unit. Of course, most of the household surveys are intended to be at a household level, but in the case of IDP identification, it's also important to consider individuals. We have been discussing today also that there are cases when one household is composed by IDPs and non-IDPs. So it's important to capture how many people within the household are considered IDPs. And of course, this could be time consuming because then it will mean that we need to ask some of the questions in the interview to all the household members. But ideally for these modules of IDP identification, it's good to have that measurement unit very clear from the very beginning. And in the case of household members with a large number of members, it's good to have this question broken down to different household members. The second step on the development process for IDP identification questions is the operationalization. And here then we need to talk about the adequate terms to describe the place the IDP was forced or obliged to live. There are different caveats around what it means to be in the habitual place of residence and not to confuse it with the place of origin. So I think here it's important to capture all those terms in order to understand the different forms to understand displacement. And second is to address the involuntary nature of the move. Here we talk about the fact that forced displacement means that the person were forced or obliged to leave. And then we need to understand that as we develop the questionnaire. The third phase is the questionnaire design. And here we need to understand where to place the identification questions in the questionnaire. Of course, what we suggest always is to include one initial module around identification of IDPs, which can be also complemented by the migration history, because allowing this module to be the first will also facilitate the process to ask only relevant questions about IDPs to those who were recognized as IDPs. So this could also reduce the burden of the respondent, as we only ask questions related to IDPs to those who were recognized as IDPs during this first identification module. And of course, it's always important to test the questionnaire before we go to the field. And this is important to understand the interpretation of concepts. Of course, IRIS provides all the a common ground for the concepts like who is an IDP, what do we mean by habitual place of residence, what do we mean by forced or obliged to live. So it is important to understand that the respondents understand these concepts and that we don't create a bias when they respond the questionnaire. And if there is need for translation, of course, it is important also to test that at some point before we go into the field to run this questionnaire. Basically, what we did also with this paper was to analyze the set of questions that the IRIS suggests for IDP identifications in censuses, but we also suggest some additional questions for identification of IDP in service. So basically, I mentioned one of them, which is the application of all these questions to all household members. And it is important to capture the number of members within the household that are considered IDPs. We also suggest to be more specific, for example, when we talk about cross-border displacement. It's been mentioned here also the importance to understand that IDPs who left the country shouldn't be considered as an IDPs for the stock of IDPs, but this is also important to capture in the questions that we use for household service. And finally, the reason to move. We need to make sure that people understand that there could be different reasons to move, and in order to capture for displacement, we need to also include other reasons for displacement, like economic or familiar reasons. Just to finalize, and this is the last slide, we basically come up with a set of recommendations for IDP identification in household service. One of them is to use a mixed of methods for this IDP identification, but basically the criteria-based questions are best fit for purpose to accurately identify IDPs. Of course, the choice of the unit of measurement is very important. Most of these households are at a household level, but it is important to capture IDPs at an individual level. And of course, also IRIS recommends a set of questions for IDP identification. So we recommend to apply these questions constantly and complemented with some of additional questions to make sure that we're understanding the nature of displacement and the concepts that are also introduced by and endorsed by IRIS. And the profiling of displacement situations. So, of course, we typically sample displaced and non-displaced population. That this is something that we would also encourage, and is to use household surveys also to allow this comparison and to allow understand if displaced families are facing different challenges and displacement related needs that host communities may not have. These are the main takeaways. Thanks, Olena, and I'm giving the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Oscar. These main takeaways are very essential, not only from the point of view of preciousness of the webinar itself, but it is also a great and valuable input into further development of the roadmap. So thank you very much for outlining the IDP survey methodology and your recommendations concerning household surveys questions. They are very important, and thank you very much for this and for being with us today.
Okay, I'm very glad to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Carlos, from Regional Coordinator in Center of the Monitoring of IDPs in Asia, to share with us in which way national data have been integrated on the global picture. And I want to IDMC, who is outstanding member of EGRIS, for their participation and in the work of our in Ukrainian working group of EGRIS. And IDMC was formed in 1988 as a part of Norwegian as an organization institution to give high-scale information on IDPs, and to develop informed policies and making operational decisions to decrease the risk of IDPs global level. Ricardo, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena. Good afternoon to all. I trust you can see my screen. Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to be presenting today here on IDMC's work and how we frame national data within a global picture. As you may know, and as Elena mentioned, IDMC is an organization founded by NRC in 1998, and we are internationally mandated to systematically monitor and analyze internal displacement globally. So an essential part of what we do is to monitor displacement events globally and consolidate estimates of the number of people internally displaced by conflict, violence, disasters, and development projects. Our work also has a research component, namely we complement this global data, these estimates, with interdisciplinary research into the drivers, the patterns, and the impacts of internal displacement in different countries. And finally, we use this evidence to provide tailor-made advice and support to inform global, regional, and national policymaking. So now I would like to expand a bit on our monitoring work, and I will start by outlining what we measure. So our main metrics are flows and stocks. Flows refer to people movements recorded in a given period. This can be a return movement or a relocation movement, but our main metric, it's a displacement movement, what we call new displacements. For example, a total number of new displacements does not necessarily equal the number of people displaced. So we're talking about movements and not people. For instance, in 2020, we recorded more than 30 million new displacements due to disasters globally. But this does not mean that 30 million people were displaced in that year. Now, our other metric, stocks, they represent a static snapshot of the number of IDPs in a given location at a specific point in time. The stock figure for a country may be higher or lower than the number of new displacements recorded for the same country in the same year. For example, the stock figure may be lower if the IDPs were displaced more than once. On the other hand, it may be higher if it includes people displaced in previous years. Once again, we have an example from 2020 when we recorded 735,000 IDPs in Azerbaijan at the end of the year. But we know that that is not the number of new displacements that occurred in 2020. And that's because most of those 735,000 IDPs had been displaced in previous years, not in 2020 itself. Now, we also record disaggregated data whenever it is available. And this includes data disaggregated not only by sex and age, but also by other characteristics. This methodology builds on the definitions set in the guiding principles on internal displacement and also is in line with the international recommendations on internally on IDPs, the IRIS. So one of the main things we do is to record new displacements throughout the year and produce consolidated estimates for each year. Here in this map, you can see the different displacement events that took place in 2020 with disaster displacement in blue and conflict displacement in orange. You'll see that during this presentation, I'll be referring to 2020 data because we have not finalized the consolidation of our figures for 2021. Now, as part of our monitoring process, we compile and interpret data that at first glance might not seem directly linked to internal displacement. Some of the key terms that indicate displacement and that we analyze relate to the movement of people, as you can see here in the first column. These are, for instance, displaced, evacuated, relocated, forced to flee, but also terms that relate to their situation, sheltered or homeless, and also to the state of their housing, uninhabitable or destroyed, which we use as indicators that displacement has occurred. In 2020, we analyzed over 6,000 documents from which we extracted over 14,000 pieces of evidence of displacement. These documents came from a wide variety of sources, including government, media, and civil society. So for this reason, our monitoring work requires us to analyze the data we collect and harmonize it. By harmonization, I mean that we have to interpret what several data labels mean used by different actors and record them in our database in a standardized manner. This relates to what Oscar was just talking about in terms of the standardization of terms in service, but we don't do that just for data that we obtain from service, but from various sources. So for instance, figures that are reported as number of evacuees or people in shelters, they will be recorded as a new displacement. But harmonization has to be done not only for these terms that indicate displacement, but also for other key characteristics of a figure, such as the location and time frame of displacement, the event to which the displacement was linked, and also the type of hazard or violence that triggered that displacement. All of these may be reported under different labels by different actors. So for example, what an agency may report as a displacement due to floods, another agency may report simply as disaster displacement. So data harmonization is important because at a country level, it contributes to improving humanitarian responses, for example, by helping expedite humanitarian coordination and strengthening fund mobilization. At a global level, it is crucial to inform a precise and coordinated narrative on displacement, which in turn supports international dialogue and policy shaping. The reason why I'm mentioning all this is that we believe that our monitoring expertise can be of value to the implementation of IRIS in national context. And in fact, it has. Thanks to our unique internationally endorsed mandate, we have played a convening role and provided leadership on IDP data collection and analysis processes across the world. For instance, in Somalia, in 2018, we started a collaboration with in-country actors initially aimed at improving our monitoring and data analysis, but which ultimately led to the creation of an IDP population working group, the harmonization of data sets, and the review of the total number of IDPs in the country. So one of our key achievements was ensuring the interoperability of data sets. And this required the revision and harmonization of the periodicity of the data collection, so how often data was collected, the metrics used by different actors, the displacement triggers different actors were associating with each instance of displacement, and also a revision of the collection forms used to collect all this data. It also required coding of displacement sites so that regardless of how different actors would spell a site name, they would know that they're reporting on the same site because of a unique code. And also the creation of disaggregation of urban and rural areas. So we helped we helped identify and label certain areas as urban or rural. And this work is now basis for the agri support work in Somalia. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our work also involves supporting policy making. And this happens not only at a national level, as is the case with Somalia, but also at regional and global levels. In the past few years, IDMC's work, including to our participation in the high-level panel on internal displacement, has contributed to greater attention to disasters and climate change as triggers of displacement. For instance, displacement is now featured prominently in UN resolutions on disasters, which was not always the case. Furthermore, even though displacement is an important evidence of the impact of disasters, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction has no displacement-specific indicators. In order to address this gap, IDMC is working with IOM and other partners to develop disaster displacement indicators, which will strengthen the ability of disaster risk reduction actors to integrate displacement in their work. We're also helping challenge the notion that displacement is a problem of the third world. And we're doing that by bringing attention to displacement in developed countries, notably in Europe. For years now, our global report on internal displacement, which we publish annually, has provided evidence of how disasters in Europe have been triggering displacement. And we are also trying to bring greater attention to displacement in the region that is triggered by forms of violence other than conflict, such as the persecution of minorities. And finally, we have been also advocating for an understanding of displacement not only as a problem, but also as a life-saving coping mechanism. So bringing attention to the life-saving impact of preemptive evacuations, for example, ahead of a disaster. And our global estimates are a fundamental basis for our engagement with global actors. So in order to frame data within a global picture, we rely heavily on the estimates that we obtained through the methodology I outlined earlier on. Now, when we look back at our 2020 data, we can see that disasters accounted for about 75% of all displacement recorded. And this reflects a trend that we observe also in previous years where disasters were a major trigger of displacement. In Ukraine, most of our displacement data concerns conflict. In this chart, we can see the stock figures reported between 2014 and 2020. The decrease from 2016 to 2017 was the consequence of a change in methodology rather than an actual decrease in numbers. But now when we look at the data on new displacements, so here I'm talking about flows, and you can see those in the orange columns, we notice a considerable decrease in the most recent years. This decrease is somewhat understandable because we know most IDPs in Ukraine were displaced during the first few years of the conflict. Still, persons already displaced may still experience further displacement. And in the absence of systematic monitoring and reporting of displacement flows, such secondary displacement may be overlooked. And this is one of the key messages I wanted to deliver today, that IDMC stands ready to support the work of the technical working group in ensuring the collection of flow data, including data on multiple displacements, but also ways to report it systematically beyond the IDP registry. This is important because I'm emphasizing here beyond the IDP registry, because the mere registration of IDPs may not capture flow data. The systematic monitoring and reporting of secondary displacement metrics can contribute to an improved understanding of the long-term characteristics of conflict displacement in the country. Now, when we look at our data for disaster displacement in Ukraine, we notice a gap. In the same period between 2014 and 2020, we only recorded disaster displacements in 2016 and 2020. And these were only new displacement figures, so no stock data, and they were very limited, as you can see. But again, this is only what we were able to record at IDMC. We believe that these figures are underestimates and do not reflect the scope of disaster displacement in the country. Again, displacement is the strong people-centered marker of where increased efforts are needed to reduce exposure and vulnerability to disasters. Thus, the systematic collection, management, and reporting of data on displacement due to disasters, including slow onset disasters, may help Ukraine strengthen disaster risk reduction policy and support the implementation of the Sendai framework. And this is another key message, and it's my last point here, another key message I wanted to deliver today, that IDMC also stands ready to support such efforts by mapping and identifying ways in which data from the State Emergency Service of Ukraine or other sources can be used for the purposes of IDP statistics. Also by contributing to harmonization of disaster data, and also by supporting the integration of disaster data into the unified information database of IDPs, or supporting the creation of a separate registry of persons displaced by disasters. This is what I wanted to highlight today. Thank you once again for the opportunity, and please let me know if you have any questions. Over.
Thank you, Ricardo. Another extremely valuable input to today's webinar and also to future development of the roadmap. Thank you for all those insights you shared with us, for your contemplations and suggestions that are undoubtedly worth of attention. I'll switch to Ukrainian. Отже, шановні учасники,
dear participants, our panelists already spoken, and now we move to the Q&A part because we exceeded our time for our event. The most questions we received is about the materials. We will provide materials to all registered participants, and we almost finalized our internal document, and we will make it available at our website, at an IOM site, and you will be able to watch again the video of this event in English and Ukrainian language later at our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. And with regards to the questions on the topic of our webinar, what from the experience of Georgia and Serbia we can recommend to Ukraine? Anastasia, you already covered this issue, but maybe you can reiterate some key factors that you can mention one more time. Thank you for the questions. I won't be able to do it in one sentence. Two major issues. First is registers. Two is template surveys, and then censuses. With regards to registers, Serbia and Georgia had different approaches in preparing registers, and Georgian experience is more relevant for Ukraine because in Ukraine, also as in Georgia, statistics of the total number of the IDPs based on the fact of registration. And in Ukraine and in Georgia, they had issue about the non-accurate data of the total number of IDPs. What helped to solve this issue, this full re-registration of IDPs? I would like to suggest this issue as one of the to the agenda of the IRIS working group and to talk how we can do it also in Ukraine. And the second is the census. We can identify IDPs during the censuses, and the only challenge is that after that you will get the discrepancies between admin data and between the data based on the results of the census. And later you will have to think on the governmental level which data to be considered as official statistics and how they should be interpreted and how they should be worked on. With regards to the template surveys, we're talking about integrating questions about the IDPs into the regular surveys. The main issue is how representative these surveys are, because IDPs, they work in certain areas, and it's not always possible to make this template representative. In order to receive data about IDPs, we cannot really integrate them into generalized surveys. Thank you, Anastasia.
Another question comes from Facebook page, and it addresses Aina, Hisham, and Simone. What can you advise for improving IDP register? Meaning IDP register in Ukraine, I guess. Aina, Simone, please.
Thanks. I wasn't sure if the colleagues want. Oh, Aina, please, by all means, go ahead for it.
I'm happy for you to go first, Hisham.
No worries. I think it's basically about acknowledging the limitations of IDP registration rather than thinking about how can we improve it, because there's only so much improvement that can be done to IDP registration before you end up running into the same issues that we were going over earlier. You can have the best identification questions in the data set. You can try as much as possible to include indicators for the 10 criteria of overcoming the end of displacement. But the problem you're always going to run into is that the data you'll get from the register is not comparable to that of the national population, because simply put, the data for the the general population, IDPs are also part of the national population, obviously. The data for the general population is coming from household surveys. And the way that questions are phrased in surveys, sampling methodology, mode effects, etc., all the statistically minded colleagues would be happy to tell you that comparability is not just about including a topic in common between different data sources. There is very strict methodical guidance on this issue. And you simply will not be able to produce comparable data on IDPs. And that puts you in a weird situation where you end up making statements. Apologies, I'm saying you, but I'm giving general example, where Ukraine will end up producing statistics saying, for example, 30% of the IDP population is unemployed, but you're unable to compare that figure to the unemployment rate in the national population. If the unemployment rate for the national population is 20% or 40%, it's difficult to compare that figure to the 30% because of the differences in methodologies, and as such, you wouldn't know if the IDP situation is actually improving or not. So if I had to give one piece of advice on how to improve the IDP registry, I would say look as much as possible into how it could serve, for statistical purposes, obviously, look as much as possible into how it could serve as a sampling frame, while being mindful of the limitations of the coverage of that registry as a sampling frame and of the need to complement the registry with additional data sets for more comprehensive information. Likewise, as I had mentioned, apologies if I'm talking too much, but likewise, as I had mentioned during my presentation, on the need to, as much as possible, explore the possibility of record linkage, which means you already have data from the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, etc. It would be a missed opportunity if you are not able to link the UID with the data that's coming from these other government entities to be able to monitor more closely the process of integration and overcoming of displacement-related vulnerabilities. Thank you, and over from my end.
Yeah, and that would be my 2 cents as well. Especially the last point there that Hisham mentioned on making sure that the registry is interoperable with other registries and talking to those, because that would also enhance the up-to-date information in the registries, and also lessen the burden on administering the registry. So that would, yeah, something I would support as well.
Thank you very much, Aina. Simone, anything to add?
I think I echo what our colleagues mentioned. I would say a reassessment of the process being used, considering the purpose. And again, if registration is to be used for a sampling frame, consider the undercount in that design and other methods and sources that could be used to expand on your sampling frame. But yeah, re-looking at those distinctions between registration and enrollment might also be something to consider. But I am also not an expert on the Ukraine registration modality. Thank you.
Дуже дякуємо, Simona.
Thank you, Simona. Dear colleagues, dear participants, we extended time of our event. Thank you very much for being with us today during the presentations of our analytical survey as a part of the preparing roadmap for IRIS harmonization with Ukrainian methodology in statistical. And thank you to EGRIS for their constant support and partnership on our way. And we will work together in such efficient and vigorous manner. And we will be keeping up the productive atmosphere of our working group. And I hope our next webinar will be dedicated to presentation of the already prepared roadmap. Let's keep in touch. Have a good day and take care. Goodbye.